Hey, welcome to Modern-Day Hysteria. I am very excited that you are here, and I'm very excited that we have 8 people with us tonight in our first party panel. So this is going to be a lot of fun. We have got questions that we hope are somewhat original or new. So hopefully maybe you even haven't heard of some of them, or you've at least heard of them maybe a little bit less often compared to questions like, does God exist? So without any further ado, I want to introduce our guest tonight. We have, like I said, 4 theists and 4 atheists, and they're of different stripes. So that's why I think this will be a good time, is they'll be able to share different ideas that they have from their unique background. So I'm going to start with the Atheist Edge first. So Jim from Atheist Edge, would love to hear what you are doing at your channel right now.
Hey, yeah, I'm Jim Hall, Atheist Edge. My other half, Courtney, was just on Objectively Dan last night, I think, or night before, down in Austin in person. That was really awesome thing. Go and check out Objectively Dan. She's got a psychology background, so they talk about the psychology of belief and faith. Right now, we're right in the middle of a 7-part critique of J. Warner Wallace's Cold Case Christianity. He's a Christian, a former homicide investigator that uses that to talk about the historicity of Jesus and the legitimacy of his miracles. So I got a lot of atheist YouTubers to be a part of that. Suris is one of them here, and we're doing also we're planning an expose on homeopathy, and we're doing an adaptation of a rewrite of The Emperor's New Clothes from an atheist perspective. So we got that coming up.
Awesome. Lots of stuff, and encourage you, everybody. The links for everybody are down in the description already. Even if you don't agree with them, I encourage everybody to go over, check it out. That way you can at least understand what they mean or where they're coming from. So next we have Mr. Brass. So Mr. Brass is actually a theist, but a unique kind of theist. So Mr. Brass, if you want to introduce yourself, just specifying what kind of theist you are, as well as just sharing about what you're doing at your channel.
Hello there. I'm Mr. Brass. I run my own little channel. I basically do philosophy and history, and I go into occasionally some scientific papers, although that's not really my thing. I'm a bit of the odd duckling out when it comes to the theist community because I'm a deist. So I'm not a Christian or like any of the revealed religions, and I'm mainly just do my own thing on my channel.
You betcha. Well, glad you're here. Next, we have Jackson Wheat returning. Glad to have you, Jackson, if you want to share what's going on at your channel.
Glad to be here. Thank you. Well, my channel teaches about primarily evolutionary biology, but I also occasionally bump into creationist topics. Right now, working on a series on dinosaur phylogeny, starting with the ancestors of dinosaurs, working our way up to the final group, which will be a secret, unless you already know. So, really just that, and doing school stuff also. Got finals coming up, so that's unfortunate.
Busy time, I'm sure. And we also just had Standing for Truth just entered. So Standing for Truth, happy to have you here. We just heard from your rival, Jackson Wheat, and so would love to hear from you, Standing for Truth. What's going on at your channel? Glad you're here.
Hey, thanks for having me on, guys. I'm excited for tonight. Nothing too crazy going on my channel, just the usual. Few new discussions, new obviously video clips. Certainly excited for this. Excited for my discussion with RJ Downard, I believe on Wednesday. Nice to see that he's here as well.
Yep.
But yeah, I'm certainly excited to obviously talk and share ideas with all you fine gentlemen.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Thanks. Glad you're here. And next, we have another newcomer, Suris. Really glad to have you here. Thanks for joining us tonight. Would you like to share what's going on at your channel?
Sure thing. My channel is called Suris the Skeptic. I have a few different shows on there. I've got LHAC, where it's called Let's Have a Conversation, where I go into topics about philosophy. I have Dangers of Woo, where I tackle pseudoscience. And then I've got your standard video responses, because apparently your skeptic card gets revoked if you don't do those.
Awesome. Really glad to have you. And another newcomer, Jonathan, very glad to have you here. Would love to hear what's going on at your channel, Jonathan. And Jonathan, by the way, he's a theist, so I've been kind of flipping back and forth with atheist, then theist, and so forth. So Jonathan is a theist. Glad to have you here.
All right, thank you for having me. Well, my name is Jonathan Sheffield, and over the last probably 2.5 years, I've created cartoon animations on my channel dedicated to the subject of New Testament textual criticism, explaining how we got the text of the New Testament. I actually have an upcoming debate with Dr. Carrier on his blog on the long ending of Mark on December 10th. Over the next probably 6 weeks, I'll be recreating the entire debate with Dr. Carrier from the blog into a cartoon animation.
Awesome. Well, glad you're here. And RJ, returning after your debate with the controversial Kent Hovind, and as well as, that's right, Jackson has as well. So glad to have you here, RJ. What's going on at your channel?
I continue to do my evolution hours every Wednesday, which is basically on evolution and science issues. I bump into creationism that way. I probably discuss more religion concepts on Twitter, where I have that and where you've encountered me. So, and I am currently writing with Jackson a new book, criticizing the Answers to Genesis Answers book series. And with a little bit of luck, we'll have that one out next year.
Awesome.
Which is not far away.
Yeah. Definitely. Well, glad you're here. And then last but not least, we have NephilimFree. So he's been on YouTube for a while, a long history on YouTube, and glad to have you here. Can you share with us what's going on at your channel?
Thanks for having me. It's going to be fun to be here. My name is Evan. I go by NephilimFree on YouTube. I opened a channel back in 2007. I do Christian apologetics. I do largely discussion about the scientific invalidity of evolution theory and evidence that intelligent design and special creation are both true. Although I do discuss scripture and the history of Christianity and philosophy some. I enjoy debate. That's probably my favorite thing, is to debate creation versus evolution. And I consider myself a young earth creationist, fundamentalist, non-denominational Christian. That's a mouthful. And so thanks for having me. Looking forward to being here with you guys.
Yeah, thanks for being here and boldly wearing the badge of fundamentalist. That's impressive. Most people shy away, but you could say you're putting the fun back in fundamentalist. So glad you're here, NephilimFree. And next, we're jumping right into the question. So I'm going to largely step back, and I'm excited to hear your guys' ideas. I might jump in a little bit to maybe share an idea, but my goal is to kind of let the conversation go as freely as possible. And the first question actually is, it's commonly debated, oftentimes among Christians, but also atheists will jump in the debate on whether or not, and so these will be out of order because I sent a lot of you guys the questions and we're kind of jumping around. So they may not necessarily be in the same order, just so you know. But you did see this question, which is that normally people ask, if, let's say, creationism is false, does that falsify Christianity? And, you know, some Christians will say, well, no, it doesn't, because we think that evolution fits just fine within the scriptures. But I'm kind of curious, what does it follow theoretically? I know that a number of you, I think most of you actually, would say you don't buy special creation. But theoretically, if it were granted, what would follow? So namely, if there were a young earth, let's just say we'll start with that, and there was a global flood, only granting those two things, what would follow? Namely, like, what religions should we narrow it down to? Or maybe we shouldn't even narrow it down to a group of religions that are possibly, you could say, reporting that that's the way we came from. Maybe you would say maybe atheism is still tenable on a young earth. I'm kind of curious what your guys' thoughts are on this question.
Nobody want to tackle that one? I will.
Go ahead, RJ.
Yeah. Well, the argument kind of went in a double direction in there. If the global flood, as described in Answers in Genesis, is actually a physical phenomenon, then yipes, it's God of Abraham religions, because nobody else has that in their doctrine. And that would be absolutely spectacular. The evidence isn't that. So that's another issue of whether or not Christianity requires that. Most Christians have managed to accommodate the geological system. They managed to accommodate heliocentrism. They managed to get past flat Earth even before that. So there's been an awful lot of of goalpost moving. On the old Earth creationist side, has no problem incorporating the Big Bang into their views. So it's very most religions that have had any legs have ways of accommodating new material and kind of looking to the side about the stuff that they regret from other times. So if you could argue that the Christianity of Francis Collins is not functionally falsifiable, the Christianity of Ken Ham is, because he's making empirical statements about the universe. So there's a gauntlet thrown.
I would say that it's true that the creation is so infused in a fundamental way in the Christian scriptures that it's absolutely necessary to the gospel of Jesus Christ being true. If it weren't true, then even the statements of Jesus Christ, where he said, "Have you not read," referring to the Moses Genesis creation account, that he who made them in the beginning made them male and female, even the words of Jesus Christ would be refuted if evolution were true. Fortunately, we don't have to worry about that, because creation has been intelligent design has been so scientifically verified today. But it is true that that's a huge subject. I think by the scientific data relating especially to genetics and the fossil record and geology. Can I finish my statement, please? I would say the most profound evidences for that would be the evidence from genetics, the evidence for the fossil record, and the evidence of the geological evidence of the Noahic flood.
All right, we'll let Jackson take on that.
I would, as much as I would absolutely love to just rip that all to shreds, I would honestly, as my personal opinion, like to go with the question, because we could literally spend the entire time just hashing this back and forth.
I agree. I completely agree.
And I've actually done that on this channel, and so
we're happy to set up. Yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, Jackson. I agree with Jackson. Jackson, I totally go with Jackson. I appreciate, Jackson, you resisting the temptation in using your self-control. That's impressive, because I can understand that it's kind of like, I want to jump in, and so let's stick to the question of
I'm sorry if I'm a party pooper. I'm sorry, everybody.
No, it's good.
Somebody's got a ton of static on their end, by the way.
That might be me. I apologize if it is.
This isn't Atheist Edge, so we don't need to go on 3 or 4 tangents.
Jackson, I'm excited to hear. It sounds like you have a thought on what's been said so far, or the question itself.
I have to agree. I pretty much agree in totality with RJ. I think we do obviously see lots of Christians have rationalized the scriptures in such a way that they don't need a 6-day creation or a Noachian flood to believe in Jesus and Yahweh and all that. So I think you can absolutely fit, the science into your religion and be just okay with that. And that's actually the world I would much rather have, a world full of theistic evolutionists than young Earth creationists. So
I hear what you're saying. Okay, somebody got rid of the static. Thanks for doing that. And then Jackson. So I mean, I'm surprised though that the atheists here seem to be. I would be more skeptical. I don't think it would have to follow that an Abrahamic religion is true, because, for example, I'm not sure that you couldn't have some sort of atheistic universe in which you have a young Earth that happens to have a major flood. I mean, like, does that seem? I mean, maybe you would say, well, it would strongly corroborate these scriptural, the Abrahamic scriptures of Islam, Christianity, and Judaism.
Actually, if I could jump in there real quick, I think if we're looking at scripture, and if we look at, say, 2 Peter 3, which talks about how in the end times, in the last days, there's going to be scoffers, and what it says is that they're going to be willingly ignorant to 3 things. Right? The creation, the flood, and the coming judgment. And at the end of the day, that seems like those are the big 3 things that a lot of us are disputing about and are in conflict about. So I think if the evidence, say the empirical evidence, points away from that, then obviously that invalidates the scripture. So at the end of the day, that would be a tough. I know there's a lot of, theistic evolutionists, a lot of, Christians who have denied, say, a global flood, for example. But obviously, according to 2 Peter 3, that would be a prophecy of, what we actually see today. There are people denying that flood. So it seems like a tough position to take if you're a Christian and you deny, say, something like a global flood.
a 6,000-year-old Earth vice a 4.55 billion-year-old Earth would invalidate at least 24 fields of scientific endeavor. So we as skeptics would have really no foundation to stand on. But that doesn't mean the Abrahamic God automatically wins by default, because there's 300 active religions on the planet. But it would definitely invalidate our foundation.
I think if you compare the Christian religion to other religions and you look at their religious texts, I think that you could logically invalidate every religion but the Christian religion if we found out, let's say, the Noahic flood was true, or if a special creation was true. I mean, you consider those religions and their mythologies, they're full of crazy ideas, you know, about whatnot, planets slamming into each other and crazy stuff, and gods that produce other gods and then get overthrown by their son to be the king of the gods. It's all pretty wishy-washy, mishy-mashy kind of stuff when you compare that to the Genesis account. I think if somebody came at it intellectually, I think it would be easy to wipe all that stuff off the table and leave Genesis alone.
Also, if you look,
is it really?
actually, if you look at Genesis too, like, I'm not sure about all the other religious texts, but Genesis 1:1 says, "In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth," which actually indicates that that's a creative force outside time, matter, and space. But from what I understand about a lot of the other religious texts, especially if you're looking at, you know, more Greek mythology, Roman mythology, Norse mythology, you know, these gods exist within the universe, right? So that in Genesis 1:1 is consistent with what we know about empirical science, that obviously, you know, time, matter, and space must have come into existence outside of time, matter, and space. Go ahead.
That's a modern interpretation of that. You don't find that conceptually in the church to begin with.
Yeah.
And you've also got the circumstance that an awful lot of Genesis is borrowed from both the Babylonian and Enuma Elish mythology that they picked up during the Babylonian captivity, and certain amounts of Egyptian mythology. No. So the Genesis is not a standalone thing. And if you're looking at it from other points of view, you should read the apologetics from the other religionists. They're just as clear that, oh, their view is reasonable and intelligent, and it's everybody else's stuff that is wacky.
Well, I think we have to look at their views and what their scriptures say, compare with the empirical evidence. Because like I'm saying, you know, even if we look at the second law of thermodynamics, which is the law of increasing entropy, that's certainly consistent with, say, a universe that's winding down. And especially if you look at, you know, the fall, you know, after the garden, that's certainly consistent with obviously entropy on a, you know, in the universe, and obviously on a genomic level. So what I see, you know, empirically in the science realm is certainly consistent with what we look at in Genesis. But if we look at other religious texts, if it's certainly, you know, inconsistent with a lot of what we see in science, then I think that would invalidate their text, you know, for sure.
I think it's a good point. Another good point would be that if we compare, for example, these religions, I don't see any validity to the idea that the Genesis account is borrowed from the Babylonians. For example, in the Babylonian myth, the fellow, I've forgotten his name, he rides out a flood. Yes, so, rides out a flood on a square barge and then gets off with all the animals. Makes no sense whatsoever. God could have just told him, hey, get the heck out of there, because there's going to be a flood that wipes out the next 10 square miles.
I wasn't referring to the flood. I was referring to the creation.
But then when we compare that to the geologic evidence, we find the continents are covered by an average of 1,800 meters.
But we also find evidence that where the cradle of civilization was a flood plain.
Okay, hold on 1 second.
Let me finish my statement.
We would let you finish.
Nephilim, I think you think Nephilim. Hold on, Nephilim. I hate to cut you off. I'm really sorry, but I think so. I know that James Downard suggested that it was borrowed, and we know that for sure you disagree with that, and you've kind of already elaborated on and why. And so it's like, I'm not trying to say that you're wrong. I'm just trying to say, like, it's clear that you're alluding to the idea that you have a response, and I just don't want to get bogged down on that topic. And so I'm really sorry to kind of stop you, but I wonder if we try a new topic, if we might, it might go a little bit more without getting too rabbit holed, but I have a feeling it may not.
I mean,
rabbit holes are fun.
I mean, I wanted to go into it a little bit. I was waiting. I was seeing about you guys. I mean, obviously, I don't really have a problem with evolution or whatever, because, you know, I'm not a Christian or whatever. And I honestly think that, you know, because I've watched Hugh Ross's stuff. I've I've listened to Michael Heiser. I've subscribed to Sentinel Apologetics with Robert Rowe and all that. You know, I don't see that. You know, we also got guys like Philo and Augustine who were perfectly able, even thousands of years ago, to see Genesis as somewhat allegorical. So, I mean, if it really comes out to, I don't really think Christians are forced to take a young earth position. I don't really see either way that they have to really force it.
And so the young earth position is a recent thing. That's not a
exactly
idea. That's like 1940s onward.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, it's also, when you actually do look at the history, it's almost exclusively a Protestant. Like, of course, there are Catholics that are young Earth creationists, but
well, even if we don't look at Genesis, Mr. Brass, I mean, how would, you know, taking that position, if you look at 2 Peter 3, where we're seeing a foretelling of the last days, and you know, Peter, the Apostle Peter, is telling us that people in the last days are going to you know, reject or deny 3 things, and the global flood is one of them. And if you look at the text, it's talking about the world that then was, which is the pre-flood world, being overflowed with water, perished. So there's really no other way to interpret that, especially if it's comparing, you know, obviously in the end times judgment by fire, which is worldwide. So this would have to, by comparison, also be a worldwide flood. So how do you reconcile that with obviously the obvious text here we're looking at in Scripture? Go ahead.
The one way that you could reconcile it, honestly, is to understand that Peter was written in the 1st century. This is not a text that was written around the same time as any of our texts written about the global flood. So if Peter is assuming the global flood as a reality in the 1st century, when there was not as much when there were not as many ways to actually verify that this happened, when he was just pulling from the oral and written tradition and pulling his scripture from that, you can easily say that he was working with information that he didn't necessarily have all the pieces to. That's not very hard to do.
You might be working with the Genesis account, which clearly speaks of a global flood. I mean, the text is absolutely clear the event was a global one, and the statements of Jesus Christ acknowledged it was a real geologic event. So it would invalidate Jesus Christ, and it would invalidate the Genesis account, which clearly tells us of a global event.
Then especially if Jesus says, you know, at the beginning of the creation, you know, he made male and female, indicating, you know, Adam and Eve. But if, you know, the beginning of the creation was, say, billions of years before that, then obviously, you know, Jesus was obviously mistaken, or he was lying. So I think that's a pretty strong accusation towards Jesus.
I would argue that he probably would be more mistaken than lying, honestly, but I also come from the viewpoint that Jesus was just a prophet, not necessarily the true Son of God with all of his abilities and all of his knowledge. So him being mistaken is fairly consistent with just a historical look at the text.
I guess what my question would be then, would you say, looking at the text, obviously if you just look at it as a story and Jesus was a man, but looking at the text itself, isn't it clear that Jesus, you know, I know you say he's mistaken, but isn't it clear that he was talking about obviously a young earth, if the creation of Adam and Eve were the beginning, and if he's speaking of a global flood, especially in 2 Peter 3. So Scripture in the text is clearly talking about a global flood and a young creation, isn't it? Even if he's mistaken, is my point.
Well, it would.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment, that the people who in the early times spoke of Noah as a real person, but it isn't really the case that any of the people in the New Testament had a clear sense of chronology on this. This is why, as the scientific method developed in the 16th century on the upcoming geologists and all of the other scientists, most of whom were very deeply religious, from Nicholas Steno through to Adam Sedgwick, they had to grapple with the data they were seeing and how to fit that into a framework. But any attempt to treat the discussions that are in the New Testament as though they have some scientific rigor to them is just doomed.
Well, I mean, if we look at, I'm just curious of everyone's ideas on this. If we look at the Old Testament, which talks about, you know, God sitting upon the circle of the earth, and it also talks about how God hangeth the earth upon nothing, you know, that seems to indicate a spherical earth hanging free float in space. Now, how would they know of this back then, say thousands of years ago, when this wasn't known until
by observing anything with a telescope, which we know they had at that time. If you look at every other planet up in the heavens and you see that all the planets are consistently a round shape and they're consistently hanging up with nothing suspending them, the next logical conclusion would be that the planet that you're sitting on isn't much different.
Okay, but
well, I mean, obviously, guys, you have to realize that the planets are actually just sitting like close on like a dome shape, and they're just sort of like,
we got flat earther here.
You know, it's
in the original,
I mean, it's clearly we have a firmament right here, and it's just raining in.
Okay, but I guess the point to be taken from that is the scriptures, especially in regards to, you know, the shape of the earth and in space, right, hanging free floating in space, it is consistent with what we know about empirical science. And if we look at Genesis 1:1, a creation outside time, matter, and space is consistent with what we know about the first and second laws of thermodynamics. So scripture seems. Go ahead.
Don't bring the second law of thermodynamics in here. That's such a colossal red herring. Yeah, jump in, Jackson.
I actually used I was part of a video a while back where I think Suris, you were too, where different atheists asked questions for theists, and my question regarded the global flood. And there were a bunch of theists who wrote kind of a response to this whole video. They also wrote a response to my question. Well, I used I think that was that one. I've done a few flood videos. Anyways, the point is, I used a source, which was a Christian source, talking about how it wasn't, the word that they used wasn't a sphere. God wasn't sitting on the sphere of the earth. It was the circle. And the point that he made was that if you are a person living in this ancient time and you're standing on like a tall point and you look out around you, it looks like a circle, not a sphere. So the word that they use is circle for that reason. The earth is not a circle. A frisbee is a circle, right? Not a sphere.
So, someone in the live chat just said that they're a theistic evolutionist, and it made me think. I was thinking about Hugh Ross and some of these prominent theistic evolutionists. So, how does for the believers here? I mean, is that a valid point? And to me personally, I think that's a non-overlapping magisteria. I think it's perfectly compatible, because all that's necessary to maintain your Christianity is that Jesus Christ was the Son of God. He did resurrect after 39 hours, and he did die for your sins. Anything else is superfluous, right?
Actually,
yeah,
I would agree with. I can just respond to what Jackson said too, because I'm not sure if we agree on this, but obviously there's no such thing as a circle, say, in real life. Right. And I think if you take even one geometry class, you know, you're going to realize that, because a circle is a two-dimensional object, but every object in this world has 3 dimensions to it. Right. So technically a circle is just a theoretical shape. So the only way we could
you got a
circle
pizza,
would be based on man's perception.
That's a 3-dimensional object.
Well, even if the earth is 1 inch thick, it is no longer a circle. So the definition of a circle is a two-dimensional.
That's parsing.
Okay, what I'm trying to say, I will make
any theologian in the first millennium who described these issues in that way. This is a question that only came up as the new science developed, that it became painfully obvious that the earth was a globe, and eventually they had to give up the flat earth. Cosmos Indopleustes was still pushing the point in the 4th century, but he was kind of dying hard. And then you get the Aristotelian revolution, which was folded into the Christian church. This is not something that the people who wrote the Bible in the Bronze Age out as an issue.
But the issue is not that. The issue is how somebody understands what they're reading when they read that account in the Bible. If you carefully read it, what you'll see is it's actually alluding to an architect, using a tool to draw a circle. It says he sits on the corners of the earth. Now, nobody believed in ancient times the earth was a cube or a square. This is a literary device. He's speaking of looking down upon a piece of paper as an architect and using a compass to draw a circle. It's a literary device. He's not talking about the actual physical shape of the earth. He's referring to someone. This is like why in the book of Job, for example, it says the 4 corners of the earth. Did the Hebrews actually believe the earth had 4 corners? Of course not. That's ludicrous. So this is a literary device again. It's looking at the earth on a map. So when in this passage, which uses the word chug to describe the circle of the earth, if you read it with a high school reading comprehension, you'll see it's referring to an architect using a compass to draw a circle.
So you're
it has
saying
nothing
that
to do with the dimension, the three-dimensional shape of it.
And which means it's
So the fact
consistent with science.
So the fact that we're just going to ignore the fact that the compass was invented in the early 100s, right?
Was it?
Yes.
Well,
metallurgy was not a thing up until that point.
So the Bible knows something that modern...
no, that's not what you get from that.
Well, that's the reference.
No,
that's
because the Bible
it's a
is
literary
accurate about
device in the text. It's clearly
and the Bible is accurate about empirical science, which we didn't figure out or came into knowledge thousands of years later. So the whole point is, hey, if the scriptures is accurate scientifically, you know, maybe it's something you can look at a little more seriously versus say other scriptural texts.
So you're saying a story. So you're saying that a story that was written, because the way the NephilimFree has described it, is that it was a story that was written allegorically. This is why we don't take the four corners as literal, for instance. And we know that God, in the account, he did not make Earth with a compass, because if he had made Earth with a compass, he would have needed a tool. I would assume that you don't think that your God needs any type of tool. So we're going to take the entire thing as allegory and then say that as an allegorical story, it is scientific. No, I do not accept that.
Well, no. All he's saying is, just like we use figures of speech now, like the weatherman's going to say, you know, the sun's going to rise, the sun's going to set. Obviously, that's figure of speech, and the Bible uses the same thing.
I'm saying the figures
of the earth. But you're using both at once in this instance. You're saying it's both a figure of speech and literally true.
That happens many times in the Bible. I mean, look, God didn't tell us to check our minds.
That's not me.
God didn't tell us to check our minds at the door when we read the Bible, and also didn't.
Is that figurative or literal, though?
The Bible is a literary work, and it's to be taken literally. There's historical narrative in it, there's parable in it, there's allegory in it. I mean, if we just read it as a literary work, we can. It's not too hard to see that this is a literary device. God's not looking down on four corners of an earth that he made. I mean, so why would we believe that he's not referring to...
In the case of the four corners, is that literal or not literal?
It's a literary device.
Exactly.
So it's not literal.
We're reading it literally, but we're taking it appropriately as a literary device in that sense. I think it's obvious.
So I put on my God glasses before I read it, so I can realize that it has both a figurative and a literal meaning.
Can you imagine how many times in literature the term four corners of the earth is used prior
because
to
it's a metaphor? You're right. It's a literary device. It's not meant to be taken.
That's all my point.
Okay.
One second. I want to hear Jonathan, if it's okay. So I hate to interject, but I know that Jonathan, it looked like you had something to say, and I know that it's been rolling at a fast tempo.
Oh no, it's actually good to hear everyone's views, and I do want to go back to what Atheist Edge had brought up, because I think he brings up a really important point as it relates to creationism. Even though I don't really buy into an evolutionary worldview, I don't think that believing in creationism, falsifies Christianity or not. I think everything's dependent on the resurrection, as he pointed out. So it really gives Christianity, from that standpoint, a falsifiable event there. Because that's where we can really look at and determine if Christianity is true or not. So, for argument's sake, if creationism is wrong, that doesn't falsify what the Christian method says, because it really is all dependent on the resurrection. There we have a falsifiable event that if we can either produce the body or get a tome explaining what has happened, that would be the end of Christianity on that one point.
Yeah, I would very much disagree with that. It would falsify Jesus as being the authority, the highest authority, but he would be discrediting the Genesis creation account and the flood of Noah, which is used in the Bible, not only as a geological historical event, but also as an allegory for Jesus Christ, an ark that we must get upon, a door we must go through to be saved. That allegory would be destroyed as well.
And actually, if I could interject, if we're looking at the resurrection of Jesus Christ as a supernatural event, but yet we want to look at something like a supernatural creation, a supernatural global flood, and deny those, you're just one step closer to being an atheist, because why not reject the virgin birth, and why not reject the resurrection if we're just going to reject
Not
necessarily. Hold on. Let's let Suris wrap us up on this topic. So Suris, if you want to share, and then what we're going to do is jump to a completely different topic. Is that okay?
So that's fine. So we know that mathematically we can go back to the point of the beginning of the universe to a few microseconds before t equals 0. So you can still have, simply because we have not uncovered anything there, you can have a supernatural origin there. I have no issue with that. I'm sure that most of the people here wouldn't have an issue if that happened to be the case.
I have an issue with you saying there is a before t equals 0.
Well, unfortunately, for there to be something instigating something after t equals 0, there has to be some type of before. As nonsensical as it is, right. I agree it's nonsensical. But it doesn't have, if we're dealing with the supernatural, nonsensical isn't exactly a barrier. So personally, something happening that makes t equals 0 start. I have no issue with that. Call that supernatural. If you want to do that, that's fine. Because any evidence that pops out has not actually said that that was not the case. Because we haven't been able to verify that. That's fine. When you have something like the flood, though, you have a different thing. With the resurrection, we have an issue not unlike t equals 0. We don't have enough data to verify one way or another. So if you want to posit supernatural, that's fine. With the flood, supernatural or not, it would leave geological evidence. And with the flood leaving no geological evidence of that flood happening, you then would have to go, okay, maybe that is not the case. And that's why a lot of Christians who actually deal in geology or in biology or in history generally don't have an issue with accepting a lot of Genesis as allegory, because they realize that some of it simply cannot hold up to the modern rigors of science. You want to have the beginning of the universe being supernatural? Again, that's fine. We have not discovered something for that. That has not been verified. Keep it if you want. But if we have verified something, like the global flood not being true, then by all means, I have no issue with you lying to yourself, but don't lie to us.
Well, I would say that the opposite of the truth.
Hold on 1 second. I hate to do this. I'm sorry. I know that everybody disagrees. I know that everybody has a response for the other side. But like I said, I was going to let Suris wrap this topic up.
Question.
And
I think to leave what he said hanging, I think it'd be appropriate just to at least let Neph respond, because obviously he just completely, I guess disregarded a global flood.
But then we can say the same thing to you. We can say the same thing to you and go in circles. I think it's better to just leave it.
I think that let's just be willing to give the last word and know that people can check out as well. Like, I encourage the viewers, go to Nephilim's page, and as well as go to Standing for Truth and everybody else's pages to see their responses to these things. So I hate to stop it, but like I said, we have a number of topics to cover yet.
Good point. I agree.
So the next one is maybe more controversial, and it's also interesting to think not just about the philosophical types of issues that come up with this, but also the methods for why we take one position or another, whether they be historical methods or scientific methods. Is religion as a whole, and I know that Christians might be ticked to be lumped in with other religions and vice versa, but is religion as a whole good, bad, or breaking even in terms of its effect on society?
Yeah, can I jump in at this point?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think this is a really good question. I would say that there are good religions and bad religions. Obviously, when we look at the religion of the Aztecs, system was sort of predicated on captives sacrifice to God. So the blood of those sacrifices would keep them safe. Obviously, we would look at what's coming out of that religion as being bad. Now, when we compare what the Protestants did, when they actually put the 10 Commandments first, and we kind of see this in Luther's Catechism and a number of the confessionals that come out of the Protestant teachings, there's a focus there on the 10 Commandments of God. And when we look at that, we obviously see something very good coming out of Christianity.
Yeah, can I jump in there?
Yeah.
I may surprise you by saying that religion has its good and bad sides. That human beings naturally produce religions. We always have. We probably always will. We're pattern-forming creatures. We're storytelling creatures. So we come up with things to explain not only what we think happened, but what we would like to be true. And religions fall into that set. I would suggest that if religions function in a framework of politics where they cannot enforce orthodoxy by the state, they are largely benign. And to the extent that states become controlled by religion to where they can enforce orthodoxy as they did during the Inquisition or in a completely secular context in the Soviet Union that functioned like the theocracy, then it runs off the rails. So long as individual conscience is protected, that you have secular rights going on, all the good sides of religion, building hospitals or creating great music, anybody that listens to Bach or Bruckner or Messiaen is listening to a deeply religious person communicating their love of God through their music. Well, I'm not going to give up my Bach and my Messiaen just because they're religious, in the same way that I'm not going to give up Brahms because he's a non-believer.
It's like I'm not going to give up Newtonian physics.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, Newton, who didn't believe in the Trinity,
but he was still no less a theist.
I'd say that religion has its ups and its downs, and so long as it has secular walls around it, will be largely benign. If those walls are breached, it'll run off the rails if you give it enough time.
Well, I mean, if I may interject with this, is like, I always make sure to just say history is always a thing that we have to look into and take into context, like the situation that people were going through. I do this with every religion, whether it be Christianity, Buddhism, or, you know, Islam. I just say, when we compare like the time frame, were the people doing better or worse, like prospectively, than the other people that were around them? And I mean, there's plenty of times I could literally say that, for example, Genghis Khan and his guys were doing pretty much better than Christians and Muslims on many fronts, because while Christians and Muslims were literally killing each other over their religions, Genghis Khan was actually promoting religious tolerance and encouraged philosophers from both Christianity and Islam to into his realm. So, I mean, when we go into perspectively-wise, we do see that there is a number of things, like not just historically, but, you know, philosophically, that, like, we get from Christianity. One big thing that a lot of people don't get, like, a lot of people don't know, is, like, this idea of a moral progress, when you really think about it, is actually a Christian invention that dates into Christian philosophy. Pagans did not have that sort of idea, because, like, in order to have a moral progress, we tend to have one point from another, like a bad point from a good point. But well, the thing is like, that's a Christian idea, because when you actually look back at it, people used to say, well, before Jesus, we were just full of sin, but after Jesus, now we're saved and now we're better. So that's really how, that's just one example of how Christian philosophy has sort of morphed its way into everyday life. And I always find it funny, because I often do see atheists and other people using like specific philosophies that are over, like they're arguing against Christian morality by appealing to Christian morality.
Not me.
I'd say that I kind of sit in the middle of RJ and Brass. So maybe it's because philosophically I'm a pragmatist. So for me, I'm willing to grab bits from my epistemology as long as I find them useful. That's part of my worldview. For me, what I've seen historically is that what religion has done is it's helped bring societies together that otherwise wouldn't have a centerpiece to put them together. Whether or not we need that now, I don't know. I don't have a solid answer for that. My personal thought is that I have no issue with with any religion existing side by side with me, as long as there's certain aspects that are not put into place. So, for instance, as long as religion has nothing to do with government, Government provides all the protections that any religion could want, if it can, but I would hope that there's no legislation written because of a religious doctrine. If that's
another funny thing is that, like, the whole idea of a First Amendment, like freedom of religion, was actually Christian ideas, because they wanted to get away from the British government that was favoring a national church, the Church of England. And they said, like, when they came to America, they just basically told the government, hey, look, we don't want a national church here. So
you had Puritans and you had Quakers and you had different denominations that wanted to be able to worship as they saw fit, not as the Church of England saw fit.
As long as you weren't an atheist, of course. I mean, look at the Maryland Toleration Act, you know.
I mean, I always find it funny about how this whole thing always goes, because I often do get atheists that just up and deny every bit of Christian philosophy that's occurred in the United States. But I'm saying, look, when America was founded, like 99% of the population was Protestant. Like, that was just a key thing. That's also why we didn't even have a Catholic president until John F. Kennedy.
Well, beyond that, the American law is founded on English common law, which is based on the Magna Carta, which is an extremely Christian document. So, but the thing is that, you know, you'll get people say, well, the founders of the United States, were they really Christian? I mean, you know, I'm not going to get into the arguments. You've all heard the discussions about that probably. I would say, were they genuinely Christian? That's maybe questionable for a lot of them. Jefferson was a deist, as I understand it. So, but nonetheless, the law was based on Christianity I think to a large degree. I don't think that they followed through with the Christian ideal very well after that, though.
We can probably all agree that favoring one religion over another might not be the best thing, and it's better for everyone if Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion or inhibiting the free exercise thereof. If they're all on equal footing, and just like Suris said, they're not injected into government, because it's better for everyone. Can we agree on that?
Well, yeah. I mean, personally, as you know, people would know that I'm a libertarian, so I'm against government having a lot of power to begin with, and I think that's also why, like, when you get Christianity, or you get really any religious person or anyone really into politics, that's when if you have a government that has just so much power, then no matter who you get in, whether they be religious or non-religious, that opens up the door for it to be abused.
I agree.
If there was lesser power, I mean, if there was lesser power or less enforcement, it wouldn't be as big of a deal, because there would be more checks and balances put in place to prevent that, whereas we just don't have that as much today. Could we say that that's a pretty valid point? It's perhaps
the spirit of Maimonides is needed.
I wouldn't be on board with a Christian theological state myself. Even Christ wouldn't have. Jesus said, somebody bring me a penny. And he said, whose inscription is that? And he said, Caesar. And he says, handed it back to him. Says, give to Caesar those things that belong to Caesar. Give to God those things that belong to God. So according to that statement, the ideology of Jesus would not support a theological state run by man on the earth either. He has got that planned for the future of the world. He wouldn't want man trying to institute that in the
I wasn't expecting to say this tonight, but I agree with NephilimFree.
I think it's funny, James,
Break
because
out the champagne.
You started this question out with, you know, this might be a more controversial issue, and yet everyone's agreeing with each other.
This surprises me.
Not much conflict going on here.
Yeah, all of us pretty much agree that our ability to worship or not worship in any capacity is best served by not infringing on any of those capacities and not enforcing any of them either.
I think Christianity suffered the moment it became the imperial religion. That so long as Christians believed what they did because they honestly believed it to be true and were not hurting anybody in the process, the moment the state took over and said, no, you must be Christian whether you like it or not, that's when they got off the rails.
That's why you've got the United States that is predominantly much more Christian and theocratic than, say, England, which has its own state church.
In fact, one of the reasons why America has such a vibrant religious community is precisely because we have no state church. Nobody is forced to believe in any religion, so people choose it on their own. Whereas when you get the official church, for the same reason that if you go to the Pledge of Allegiance under the Bible, everybody gets the rote routine, they're more likely to not go with it than otherwise. So here the atheist is saying secularism is religion's best friend.
This is absolutely interesting. You guys totally surprised me. I appreciate your intellectual honesty in saying, willing to concede points that a lot of atheists wouldn't want to concede. And I'm curious, and it's interesting to see, because sometimes you see Christians and atheists as strange bedfellows with regard to which religions might be harmful. Are there religions that you're concerned actually do teach bad things?
No, but interpretations of
Islam.
religions can be dangerous. Islam's not dangerous. Certain interpretations of Islam are dangerous.
I'm not saying that all Muslims are bad people, of course. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying, like, if we're going to just compare, like, if we compare, like, radical Christians in the United States versus radical Muslims, there's not, like, a radical Christian in the United States is Ken Ham, which he's a relative nobody, like, outside of, like, his Answers in Genesis community. And some biologists.
What are your thoughts then on like hate groups that are Christian predominantly?
Oh, like the KKK?
Yeah. Not just the
Matt
KKK,
Powell
but other
wanting
groups.
to kill homosexuals. He's a Jovinista.
Yeah, look at Stephen Anderson. That's another one. You know.
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, I've
point-
actually watched some of Stephen Anderson. I've always seen him as kind of an ass, to be quite frank.
I think that's a lot of people.
I know that
Just
Stephen
me,
Anderson.
Savonarola.
I know that Stephen Anderson personally doesn't like me because I've been told by Matt Powell that they've had this discussion, which is really
no one
surreal.
likes you, Cyrus.
Well, that's fine. I'm okay with that. That's why I hide behind a
I
cartoon.
like you, Cyrus. I think you're
Even
right.
Islam is a roller coaster. It had its ups and downs. It was originally spread by the sword and said convert or die, and yet it had enormous periods, probably because there was no centralized religious authority. It didn't have like a pope. Everybody was just reading the Quran individually. It underwent a long range of mutation. When the Jews were in Spain in 1492, most of them fled to Constantinople, or now Istanbul, under the Turks, the Muslims, because that was a safer place for them. Even in Spain, most Jews kept, because sometimes it was better to be on the Islamic side, and then sometimes it was better to be on the Christian side. When the Berbers came in during the 11th, way more radical than the Moors of previous century. And so there was a constant up and down. The moment any of these religions can control orthodoxy by the state arm, that's when they can become terrible, and people can picky choosy the scripture that they want to make a nuisance of themselves.
The correct view from a Christian standpoint, really, at the very basis of it all, is that all religions, which are false, are dangerous, because all of them would lead somebody not to believe upon Jesus Christ as a savior for their sin. And so the correct view, according to Christian theology, is that any religion is dangerous. They're, of course, excluding Christianity, of course.
Yeah, now,
of course.
I was going to ask Atheist Edge something regarding Islam. Because there we're talking about an ideology, and I would hope most would agree that an ideology can be dangerous. Now, I brought up the Aztecs because their ideology was predicated on not only going to war, but bringing their captives to human sacrifice. And when we look at the ideology of Islam, and we look at it historically as well, not only was spread by the sword, but even nowadays we can see, in what areas are Muslims living with their neighbors in peace. So would you not say that the ideology of Islam, and I get there's different, you can always say that there's different interpretations, but the historical Islam comes from that ideology of spreading the sword.
I often criticize the dangerous ideologies, the calls for violence, the threats of violence in the Quran and the Hadith, as well as other, other religions. But I tolerate that. I tolerate the hate. that go ahead. But when you actually convert that into a threat of violence or actually carrying out violence, that's something we can fight. And I did 2 tours in Iraq. I considered the global war on terrorism an unwinnable war. An ideology cannot be fought with a rifle. I think that was a mistake. I think it has to be fought with free thought. It has to be thought in the marketplace of ideas. And
don't you?
On the flip side of the coin, I would never suppress even a hateful ideology as Islam. If ever, like our government wanted to squash the Islamic doctrine, I would be in the picket line with the Muslims trying to keep it.
But when you go ahead and say that the United States fought communism, which was also an ideology, you know, with rifles. So why would you say that the ideology of
the physical manifestation of communism, when it becomes an act of a physical aggression or threat of aggression, that's when it needs to be fought. But just the ideology can be fought only with ideas and the marketplace of ideas.
I don't think atheism can be left off the table, too. We can say religious ideas can be dangerous, but I think atheism is an ideology in itself, and I think it has to be on the table if we're discussing ideas that have potential danger.
I mean, I would not take a real strong stance. I mean, that, like, if we're going to go like atheist, or like, you know, I've obviously, you know, I'm sure all the atheists have heard it probably a million times about the communists and stuff like that. But I mean, like, I would say that, can atheists be assholes and do things like on the level of killing people for just being religious or something? Yeah, I don't see there's no logical contradiction in that. That has happened, you know. What I've found funny is, like, I often get atheists that do deny that, but I say, like, when it came to, if it was just merely political, like, all the enemies and even communists themselves directly said that they were atheistic, and that was part of the big fight against them with the United States, is because we wanted to say, like, we were the Christian nation and these were these dirty commies, atheist. But I would not, you know, obviously I don't blame atheists for that. I don't do that just as much as I don't blame the myself, because of what some stupid deists may have done during the French Revolution.
If I can interject there. Yeah, I think I would agree with you, but I think if we look at history based on what you're saying, certainly atheism as an ideology can be dangerous. Because, I mean, if you look at, obviously,
I mean, the one common thing is that politics.
Stalin, I mean, certainly, you know, tens of millions of people were murdered based on that ideology, right?
Why did they kill people?
Joseph Stalin killed 60 million people. He didn't kill a single one in the name of atheism.
Exactly.
Even though, yeah.
Exactly. That's the point. The point is that it's about the point is that they were killing people for political power, for their own political purposes.
But would you say that these ideas, so if we look back historically, like let's say the ideas that came out of David Strauss, you know, that Christ was a myth and all these views, and then you have Marx, who was influenced and read, you know, David Strauss books, and then we have communism coming out of Clark. Not that I'm saying that
for religious people to be murdered.
Say that again.
Did Marx advocate for religious people to be killed?
No, I'm not saying.
Then what's the relevance of it?
I'm talking about the ideology, his influence that came from Strauss led to his.
So I would say I know this is engaging in tu quoque, and so it's going to be fallacious by itself. But I'm not using this as a dismissal. I'm using this as a food for thought. If you want to say all ideologies are harmful except Christianity, then you're ignoring Roman Inquisition, the Spanish Inquisition. You're ignoring forced conversions after the Constantinian shift. You're ignoring the witch trials in early modern Europe. You are going to have to ignore all of that. If you're going to take the stance that all ideologies can be harmful, and I'm willing to grant you that stance. I'm willing to be one of the few atheists that is going to go with you on the Pol Pot, on the Stalin, on all of those points, if you are willing to also not special plead for your stance.
I wouldn't be special pleading. I think
you are.
what you just said.
That's the definition of special pleading.
I think if you look at those atrocities,
that's the definition of special pleading. Every other stance is harmful except mine, ignoring these harmful things that my theology has actually led to. It is the very definition of special pleading.
Inquisition, Roman Inquisition. I mean, wasn't that due to Roman Catholicism, Protestantism? So obviously they were looking to.
So are you going to say that all of those are not Christian in any way, shape, or form?
I would. I think it's pretty obvious that, yeah, certainly they're not, especially Roman Catholics.
So if I were to get somebody with a master's in theology in Catholicism, would they agree with you?
Well, I think
the answer is no. The answer is no. They would not.
What's more true is to say that bad ideas are dangerous, whether they came from somebody's twisting of their religious idea or a twisting of atheist ideology. It's bad ideas that are so dangerous, not specifically one ideology or another. But I would point out, though, there is a historical relationship between the atheistic concept of evolution, which is purely chemicals, and communism. You know, Frederick Engels and Charles Darwin wrote letters to each other, and in fact, some of the please let me finish. Now, some of these, let me finish. Hold on, please. Allow me to finish, please. Okay, I was just pointing out that some of the famous German philosophers of the latter half of the 19th century, like Frederick Engels and Karl Marx, referred to Charles Darwin's book as the the biological, scientific basis for their ideology. They even stated so outright. Frederick Engels stated that this is the basis for our and yes, we're talking about social Darwinism, but nonetheless, look what came of it. I mean,
there's no reference to social Darwinism in The Origin of the Species.
Who started social Darwinism?
Actually, Darwin would have been against that.
Yeah, Darwin would have been against social Darwinism.
I didn't say he was
because hold on. Just let's hear from RJ's.
The Soviet Union was no friend of Darwinism. That they explicitly had a political version of air quotes evolution that was Marxist-Leninist, Lysenkoism. Yes, which believed that organisms were infinitely pliable. There was a whole ideology of education. The Darwinian genetics that was developing in the 1930s and verboten in the Soviet Union, and they screwed their whole system up altogether. There's a cottage industry, particularly in young Earth creationists and genetics, to try to lay all of the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany and all of these at the feet of Darwin. And the problem is that they're missing an awful lot of issues. It's no defense for either the French Revolution or the Soviet Union, but it is an explanation that these are cultures that came out of stultifying theists. The French monarchy and the church system was extremely oppressive and extremely dehumanizing. The Russian Orthodox system, most of the system of gulags that ended so radically under the Soviet Union, they were invented under the czars in the time. Just don't divorce themselves from their history. And the idea that any ideology comes and over overnight, no, things are way more complicated than that. And I am not a defender of the Soviet system.
James, I don't think anybody is positing that Darwinism was the driving force that led to communism. But I'm just pointing out there is a relationship. For example, on December 19th, 1860, Karl Marx wrote to Frederick Engels, who wrote later to Lassalle, Darwin's book is a very important and serves me as the natural scientific basis for the class struggle in history. One has to put away the gross English motive in development, of course. He didn't like the English way of writing. He said, despite all deficiencies, not only is a death blow here dealt for the first time to teleology in the natural sciences, but its natural meaning is empirically explained. So there was a profound connection between Darwinian evolution and the developing philosophies of the German philosophers of the latter half of the the 19th century, which were highly influential in communist thinking. Nobody's saying it's the basis for it. I'm saying there was
then if you're willing to concede that the Nazis built some of their anti-Semitism on Martin Luther, then we can have an equal playing field.
Why not?
Oh yeah, I can. I mean, what I find actually funny about that, because I actually have read a little bit on that, and I actually do find funny about how, I mean, funny enough, Jews pretty much just if you just look at the history, they've pretty much been screwed over by both Muslims and Christians throughout history.
Yeah.
And funny enough, even by the communists. So I mean, pretty much just everyone's
they
going
were
after them.
officially not anti-Semitic, but in practice they were extremely anti-Semitic.
Well, yes, I mean, pretty much no matter who gets under power, the Jews are pretty much screwed. But
bad harvest, blame the Jews.
Yeah,
so I would like to point out that and Nephilim just posted in the chat the Karl Marx quote, and I'm willing to meet both ways on the Karl Marx quote for this reason. You have people like Stephen Anderson and Powell that are extrapolating from the Bible somehow the idea that they can kill 2% of the United States population based on the Bible. I don't know how you pull that out of there, especially when you exegete it and find that Leviticus doesn't say what the fuck they're saying it does. Point is, you can pull, if you want to be selective and if you want to use cherry picking, you can pull horrible ideas out of any type of ideology or any type of epistemology. As an example, and again, if this is me meeting both ways, and I'm willing to do that, for atheism, somebody can take atheism if their entire worldview, when they deconverted, relied on God. They can take atheism and lead that to being moral nihilism, if they so chose. If somebody went that route, then they would be, by your definition and by mine, pulling a harmful ideology out of an atheistic worldview. And I'm willing to grant that. But you have to also recognize that those same harmful ideologies, those same harmful ideas can come from Christian ideology and Christian theology.
And if they acted on those ideologies in a violent manner, then even though fellow atheists would denounce them.
Exactly. As long as they have their heads screwed on right, which some don't.
Yeah. But a government run by Carl Sagan wouldn't be a violent, so Stalin, Marx, these were individuals that misinterpreted. And if they, yes, they were atheists, but if they used that nihilistic viewpoint to carry out those actions, I would denounce that.
Yeah, I mean, like, I'm obviously not saying that, Christians haven't done shitty things in the past. Like, the pagans can attest to that, that Christians have been pretty brutal to them, at least. Like, a lot of the reason why we don't have a lot of text that we would like to have on the pagans is because Christians wiped them out and burned their religious text. So, like, it's a miracle that we have, like, the manuscripts that we have. But, so, I mean, yeah, I can totally get that. Like, I do think that you can get extremes out of pretty much, like, the human brain is pretty creative in finding ways to justify its bad behavior. I always do say that that's sort of, we have a tendency to be able to scapegoat things very well, where we know we want to do something bad, like we want to, like someone violent wants to, let's say, kill someone, and that's what they want to do beforehand, but they need to have some rationale to justify it. And
we're agreeing way too much tonight.
Yeah. Well, like, some might use the Bible to justify it, or they might use some nihilistic philosophy, but I do think it's a standard principle where you have people that are just scapegoating for something that they've wanted to do beforehand. Could we think that's probably a possibility too?
There is one thing that I think most people overlook, though. When it comes to people abusing Christian theological ideas and doing evil, that's documented. People have done that, no doubt. Jim Jones, the Roman Catholics throughout the Middle Ages, etc. But here is a fundamental difference that people tend to gloss over, is that atheism and evolutionism are both purely chemical ideas. There's no soul in the soft machine, according to an atheist. Human being is just a soulless bag of matter. There's no, let me finish, please. There's no basis for believing that a human being has value in their life, that they're worth something, because there's no moral basis for saying it's immoral to cease the interaction of molecules. So technically, killing someone is only cessation of molecular interaction on atheism. It's not actually murder. Now, if human being is an evolved creature that's a purely
Hold
chemical
on, no,
process.
Nephi,
That's
Nephi,
chemical purely
I'm stopping you right there because
there is
wrong.
hold on, let me finish. There is a connection
Nephilim.
ideologically between the two that tends to be overlooked.
Okay.
It doesn't tend to be overlooked. It just happens to be that the small subsect of people that think that are so outside of the sphere of correctness, they're not even wrong.
Well, you don't believe you have a spirit, do you? If you're an atheist.
Hold on. There's a way to parse that out. So you don't believe you have a spirit. Me personally, no. But do I not believe I have a spirit because I'm an atheist? Absolutely not. There are atheists that believe in a soul. There are atheists that believe in some type of ultimate morality.
That's not consistent, though.
It doesn't matter if it's consistent. Neither is your worldview.
There are things such as property dualists, like Thomas Nagel, who is an atheist, and he takes the idea, like, he doesn't believe in a soul either, but he does take the idea that there's an immaterial aspect about human beings, and he's
the mind
an atheist.
outside the brain is one thing he posits, correct?
Yes, it's sort of like, I wouldn't say that. He more or less just says, like, there's properties of the brain and their part of them is like immaterial, but it's ultimately still in the brain.
Like the reason that I bring that up, Nephilim, is because there are atheists, and I've met them, who believe in a soul, who believe in a supernatural realm. There's nothing saying that those things must be tied to a god. Atheism deals with only one thing, and that is what your truth value assigning is to the proposition of theism. If you assign it false or disbelief in this sense of weak atheism, that's all it means. The supernatural realm does not have to follow from that god. So I would make a suggestion, if possible. Mayhap you not tell atheists what they think and let them tell you what they think instead. And maybe you'll come to common ground more often.
Well, you've already acknowledged that you don't believe you have a soul.
No, I've acknowledged. I'm
just saying it's inconsistent to believe in a soul if you're an atheist.
Just straw man. You have
it's pretty difficult to explain something like a soul in a supernatural realm.
Not necessarily. So you can take a pseudo-deistic position that leads to atheism, a deistic god that died right after creating the universe, leading to everything that's there. As an atheist at that point, you can believe that god died. It is no longer around, but it no less was the first cause there. There are atheists who can take that position, who have taken that position.
You can believe in the supernatural and deny a supernatural intelligent agent at the same time.
Exactly.
Disagree. That's inconsistent.
Well, you can say it's inconsistent, but again, I would argue that maybe you should not tell atheists what they think. I believe atheists can tell you what they think, because I'm not going to tell you what you think. If you'd like me to do so, I'm willing to think. You just did when you straw man me.
Atheism posits.
No, atheism does not posit that. Okay, find me the philosophical literature where atheism posits a denial of the supernatural.
I don't need to go to literature.
Yes, you
do
need to go to it.
One second. I think that maybe what Nephilim, to put it in other words, maybe would suggest that the most plausible form of atheism is naturalism. And if that's the case, which I think most of us would
maybe
agree
not
with
most plausible, but most common.
I think the most non-contradictory form of atheism would be natural.
I agree.
One second though, do you think atheism is nonsensical?
I do.
I know you do.
I think it's non-science.
I'm asking for the other.
You're trying to stir up the pot, aren't you?
Well, the only reason I say that is because I'm not trying to be a trickster here, but I know it was a joke earlier, and I'm not like bristled by it, but I can't help but bring it up because I know that. So I think somebody made a joke earlier, and it made me smile. Someone said that when you're talking about supernaturalism, it's not so different from the nonsense. It's not. I think Suris said it's not bounded by the sensical. It's or the nonsensical. It's just that I do think most of you probably have a greater skepticism towards supernaturalism as an idea, broadly, than atheism. And in that sense, if you do agree with me there, it does seem like the most plausible form of atheism would be one in which there is not supernatural stuff in it, right?
I would agree with you 100% on that.
Absolutely.
I mean, it would ultimately depend. Like, for example, we have non-theistic religions like Buddhism, for example, that posits really no God, but they might believe in they can talk to their ancestors, spirits,
There's
or
also
something.
there's also atheistic paganism as well as another example of of a religious structure that can have the supernatural, but it's not inconsistent because atheism doesn't deal with that question.
Like, I totally agree with you.
No,
hold on, Nephilim. I mean, I know that I said it kind of like step out, but I agree that there are these like, I'm not at all making a claim that like there are no supernatural forms of atheism. So I agree, like, you've got counter examples, and but I'm kind of thinking like, well, let me ask you, Suris, like, or anybody else who happens to be an atheist. Do you think that these pagan forms of atheism, in which they're whatever ways they're Wiccan, whatever it is, I don't know what it is, do you think that those are any less reasonable than metaphysical naturalist atheism?
I consider them reasonable. I'm a super weak atheist. I give it about a 30% probability. This is pure speculation, but as a super weak atheist, I give a 30 or 40% possibility that supernatural phenomenon does exist.
I'd probably give that as well. Maybe not 30-40%, because I know that any number that I pull out is going to be out of my butt. I can't speak for Jim, though.
Totally out of my butt. No, it's out of my butt too.
I'd be hard pressed to get 5% on that one.
But can I just say that the question, though, in particular, though, was, do you think that positive atheism, let's say the assertion that there is no God, would you really hold that paganism, the supernatural sort of paganism, is actually no less, or I should say that they would be on equal par, like that those are equally rational?
It depends on what their content is.
So for instance, sorry, RJ.
Yeah, if any. All moral precepts are presuppositional. It doesn't matter whether a religionist is doing them or an atheist is doing them. And you can have a completely secular morality, and you can build your presuppositions in a variety of ways. All of that is required. Plato would do that. Everybody else would do it. The moment any philosophy makes empirical claims about the universe, that puts them in a different category. And I would contend that if any philosophy or religion makes statements about the universe which we can verify are true, that's a little plus. If they make statements about the universe that we can determine are not true, then they got a problem. So you would have to measure it on the basis of what things say. If a Wiccan believes that they can do incantations and make a frog turn into a turtle, and we can empirically test that they can't happen, then kaboom, the Wiccan notion is not rational. And the same thing like with the Aztecs, that their human sacrifices were to keep the sun rising. Well, they stopped doing that. Sun keeps rising. Clearly, that was wrong. So it depends on the doctrines.
I guess my question would be in regards to, I'll be quick, Neff. In regards to atheism, if atheists then say have an active belief system, obviously with views concerning origins, right, that the universe and life itself arose by, natural processes, wouldn't an honest atheist then admit that their worldview is also faith and that atheism is?
No, because ours is testable, verifiable, predictable, and falsifiable.
Okay, so if atheism is contradictory to all known and evolution data, that would make atheism more of a science fiction based religion then, right?
No, it can be proven that we have a
on origins of bust, that might be the case, but we aren't.
I think we're conflating two separate issues here. It sounds like evolution and atheism are being conflated.
Yes.
And they have nothing to do whatsoever with each other at all, which we've already covered.
Posit that the universe itself arose by natural processes without a supernatural
not necessarily, as we've already talked about.
That position would be a contradictory position.
It's not contradictory just because you disagree that it happened.
Jackson, let me share something with you that I think connects the two in a way that you're not seeing.
I honestly doubt that you will have
philosophical
bring to me.
Go ahead, Neff.
The philosophical materialism of atheists and evolutionism are in fact tied.
Not all atheists are materialists.
This is a statement. I know that's inconsistent, I've been saying. Now let me provide a statement for you. This is from Michael Roos. He's one of our eminent philosophers of science. And he said, the position of modern evolutionists is that morality is a biological adaptation, no less than our hands and feet, considering a rational, justified set of claims about an objective something, objective ethics is illusory. I appreciate that when somebody says, love thy neighbor as thyself, they think they are referring to something above and beyond themselves. Nevertheless, such reference is truly without foundation. Morality is just an aid to survival and reproduction, and any deeper meaning is illusory. Now, let me give you one more. This is from Joel Marx, atheist philosopher, professor at College of New Haven, in his book published 2010. He said this. He said, I experienced my shocking epiphany that the religious fundamentalists are correct. Without God, there is no morality. But they are incorrect, I believe, about there being a God. Hence, I believe there is no morality. So he's being consistent with his atheism. The thing for him is he doesn't know how to explain the existence of morality with atheistic philosophical materialism and evolution.
And I've talked to
I have a rebuttal. I don't agree with him. And we're done.
And you're inconsistent.
No, I'm not inconsistent. You have these
morality
quotes.
is subjective.
You're just dropping these quotes as though they're arguments when they aren't. A quote is diddly in a conversation about how ideas work, about how philosophy works. Quote doesn't mean jack.
I think I've already explained how philosophical materialism and atheism are, and evolutionism are.
You haven't
so you're just going to blend all these ideas. Go ahead, RJ.
There's no.
Why am I an absolute moralist, Nephilim?
I don't
Have you ever bothered to
why
ask
you're
me?
an absolute moralist.
I believe that there are some things that are intrinsically wrong. That in all universes, for all entities, in all circumstances, owning other sentient beings is in principle wrong. No God can make it otherwise. No state or law can make it otherwise. That it is absolutely inviolate. And I can't lower my morality low enough to get under the Exodus 21 bar. Or the slavery thing that was advocated, nor can I advocate the killing of witches. Would you mind telling me, Nephilim, this was the question that I wanted to ask earlier. Sure. Would you mind telling me which Christians who killed witches in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance were basing their witch killing on anything other than the Bible? Were any of them Darwinian naturalists?
Okay, so they were inconsistent with their religious beliefs, just as atheists are inconsistent when they argue against the philosophical materialism. It's an inconsistency. I accept and understand that you appreciate that there seems to be objective moral values that are unarguable. It's wrong to murder, that is to kill without justifiable cause. That taking of life without justifiable cause is immoral. But within atheism, there's absolutely no basis for that idea. It can only be found in theism.
Excuse me, it's not. You can construct an absolute morality independent of atheism. Plato showed that you could theoretically do that. The Euthyphro dilemma is just as much of a problem. But I still want to know your question. Was the Bible wrong to say you should kill witches?
The Bible doesn't say you should kill witches. It says God instructed someone to kill a witch.
It says thou shalt not suffer a witch to live.
Does. Right, that's God's decision. It's not man's decision, right?
But does the Bible then tell you?
But here's the thing: is God unjustified? Is that murder, or is that moral justice?
Are you saying that killing another human being is justified now based on their religion?
Under divine command theory, that
without God's direction. Let me clarify: without God's direction,
even with God's direction, I'll grant you God's direction.
Let me finish, please. Without God's direction, I would say yes. So that's the thing. So what you're attempting to do is paint what's in the Bible as man's ideas are right, but this is actually a dictate from God.
That just makes him a moral monster then. That just makes him a moral monster then.
So now you've got to demonstrate that God is not justified for destroying that which is evil.
And also when it comes to subjective and objective, obviously morality, as Christians, we would say that, all our basis of morality is dictated by God and his word. So if you're rejecting God, say as an atheist, don't you make yourselves the final authority in matters of morality, which means there's no basis for a consistent morality that's actually applied to everybody?
Not necessarily. You don't have to have that. So without a God, what would we have as a moral basis? Well, we would have whatever morality is required for society to function without entire societal collapse. As it turns out, we've actually managed to do that.
Can you explain though how God would be unjustified? Is unjustified justifiable, morally incorrect for destroying evil. The witches in the Old Testament.
What makes the
Old Testament?
There is no such thing as witchcraft. There never has been witchcraft. There can never be witchcraft.
Like the dumpster fire stuff is just if you can try it as carefully as you can to slow down, and we'll try to do this as carefully as possible. So Nephilim, if you can give like a brief wrap up in that point that you were saying, and then we'll I think
we'll let Nephi have the last words since I had the last one last time.
Sure. So, witchcraft, whether you believe witchcraft exists or it's real or not, sticking within the theology of the Old Testament text and assuming that God is morally correct because he is in fact an all-powerful, all-moral being, therefore it follows that witchcraft is wicked because it leads people into false theology that's going to lead them away from having a savior, and so it does evil. So now, if what the atheist would have to do, though, is show that God is unjustifiable in destroying evil. See, you're trying to make God into a moral monster, and understand atheists love to do this.
Whether or not witches are evil.
So you would have to demonstrate somehow that God is unjustified for destroying evil.
I don't think you would ever accept such a justification, but then again, you think the earth is 6,000 years old, so you've already run off the evidence trail already.
I have all the evidence in the world.
What we'll do is just, so it's kind of, I think that's maybe fair to say we let Nephilim have the last argument there.
Yeah.
Do you feel good with that, Nephilim? Like, I don't mean to cut you off.
No problems.
Okay.
Thank you.
So yeah, you bet. So I think what we'll do now is we'll switch to a new topic, and that was definitely interesting. I'm surprised at how much we actually agreed. And we'll now cover whether or not we're willing to admit we have biases. One thing that drives me nuts, so I'll kind of goad or prod the atheists a little bit. I don't want to be unfair in kind of using broad brushstrokes, but I'm surprised when I meet atheists sometimes and they tell me, no, I don't have any biases. And I'm like, oh gosh, just because even like, so when I like confirmation bias is something that we see, it's just in everybody, is that people tend to, they like to have a feeling of like that they've got the world figured out. And so they tend to search out evidence that confirms what they already think. And that might be like propositions such as Christianity is false, or there is no God, or there's no evidence for God. That could even be affected by confirmation bias. So I guess you could tell that I'm already ready to push into you. What are your thoughts?
I have something to ask here. Is there any atheist in here that says that they don't have any biases?
I just wrote down 5 off the top of my head that I've got.
No. Thank you for that.
I can think a couple. I don't know if there's any atheist in here that agrees. I know some of the guys that are in here.
I actually had a video where I engaged in confirmation bias without even realizing it, and it was actually Aaron Raw who had to correct me on it. So no, I'd say that I've demonstrated I have them.
Thanks for your honesty. Like, and I didn't want to bring that up in such a way that I was saying that you guys all would take that position.
But James, that being said, we admit our bias.
Does any atheist in here have biases? Because I think that theists have bias, and I think that atheists have bias. But I think that the atheists in here would agree with that. That everybody that's in this room has biases.
But here's one big difference. We don't need to be right. But Christians do need to be right. It's their very existence on at stake. I don't need to be right. If it was shown today that I was completely wrong about everything, all I would have to do is take the letter A off of Atheist Edge, and I would keep it on my YouTube channel.
I don't think so. It would leave
theism. Well, I think what Neff's trying to say is at the end of the day, if you're not right, okay, go ahead, Neff.
Just say that if we disqualify atheism, then we have theism as the truth. So how could you be right if theism is true?
If theism was true tomorrow and I accepted it, it would be an easy transition. I would accept it. It would be harder for you to the opposite to be accepted by believers.
I think any biased position is hard to be accepted. I think that's true enough.
So when you say accepted, I just want to make sure I get where you're coming from, Jim. Are you saying like accepted by like our social circles, like our church friends and stuff like that?
If it could be hypothetically, just hypothetical, proven that Christians were, it's all true. Everything in the Bible is true.
God comes down in all of our rooms simultaneously and talks to us. Now that would be impressive.
I want to convert you.
I would be embarrassed as hell, but I would be able to turn on a dime. It would be not as big a deal to me but the flip side of that coin, it'd be way harder for a believer to accept the opposite.
Yeah, I mean,
I got another question actually. Evan, do you think that you have biases?
Everyone has bias, of course.
Okay, cool. I was just wanting to check because
I would agree. Everybody has bias.
Yeah, yeah, especially me. I'm probably one of those biased people I know.
Yeah,
and I mean,
a clarification here about what we mean by that. Some of this sounds very much like source methods issues, of where confirmation bias is clearly a source methods issue. How do you believe what you do? What sources do you rely on? What evidence are you willing to change your mind? Those are methods issues. To the extent that somebody has presuppositions that may or may not be true, but they believe in them and they're honest about them, you could call that a bias. I would tend to call it a presupposition. And so a bias, I would argue, would be something that is an unjustifiable impediment to clear thinking. How about that one as a
No, I wouldn't agree with that. Biases exist, I think, because people are automatically, human beings are stubborn and prideful things. We're all that way. It's just a part of our nature.
Oh, yes.
And people have a hard time changing what they believe. I mean, as a Christian, I've shown passages by the bajillions to other Christians who refuse to believe one thing or another, but the Bible clearly and extensively teaches it, and they'll call you names. So, I mean, you know, bias, it permeates mankind. But I don't think that's a basis for it. Go ahead.
One of the things that's fascinated me in this discussion so far, and I've refrained from bringing it up, but given the fact that we're now talking about how our brains work, is that nobody has been mentioning neuroscience. There's a huge amount of neuroscience material precisely on those issues of how we do confirmation bias. The anterior cingulate cortex does that. How do we do moral reasoning? We have an amygdala-based snap judgment system that gets in competition with our frontal cortex, slower rational one. That's why the trolley problem produces such unusual results depending upon how you phrase it. All of the things that we're talking about how we do more biases, the neurosystem receptors that produce group mentality is the same one that fires for stranger. So there's this yin-yang balance that we go on. So many of the things that we talk about, our prejudices and our biases, have neurological bases and ultimately evolutionary ones. And if God designed all of this, then he's put a deck stack in.
The truth is, there is no way to account for minds with physical materialism. The idea that the brain is the seat of all sentience and consciousness is not supportable. If in fact our brains were the producers of all our sentience, then opinions and free will simply don't exist, and I can easily dismiss everything that comes out of your mouth because there can't be any truth to it. Chemistry doesn't produce truth. When molecules interact with each other, they're not producing something that's true. They just interact because of the nature of the structural design. They don't produce anything. It's irrational to apply mental properties to matter. Mental properties can't be measured. They don't have dimension. You can't put a yardstick to it and say it's 2 centimeters long and it weighs 3 grams. Mental properties can't be applied. You can't measure them like you do, like you can physical objects. So human beings can only account for the non-physical fundamental entities they produce, like linguistics, algorithms, information, the aboutness, the process of observing the passing of time. These things can't be explained with the physical materialism of an atheist explaining that, or idea that minds are produced by brain.
Jackson.
We will be disagreeing on that.
So what are the types of biases? Like if we can list like concrete, you know, because everybody has confirmation. Go ahead, Jackson. Or sorry, my mind's lagging. So if we could list particular biases. Yeah, Jackson, sorry, mine was lagging, so it still had your hand up, even though that was a long time ago. Basically, I would say for me, one would be that obviously I do like the idea that there's an afterlife. That's like a broad starter. And then I like the specifics of, let's say, the Christian God over even other gods. Part of that might be because I'm used to it. You know, there's done a lot of psychological evidence that we tend to prefer what's familiar. Part of it might also be that there might actually be things that, all things being equal, if I wasn't already familiar with it, I'd still maybe prefer the Christian God for, you know, whatever the reason. So those are some reasons that I would say I'm biased, and I'm kind of curious what you guys would say what yours would be. Another one would be, I think that Jim might have been alluding to it, is that my social circles, definitely a lot of my friends are Christians. So I feel there's a lot of sociological evidence from Rodney Stark that we tend to kind of adopt eventually our closest friends' views. So I'm kind of curious what other biases there might be, both for the Christian side or for the atheist side.
I envy you guys for believing that something lives on after death. That must be very comforting. The one bias I thought of when we were prepping for the show was there's a biblical contradiction that atheists love to throw out there about Herod, who died, I think, in 4 BCE, and Quirinius, who became governor of Syria in 6 CE. So there's a 10-year date gap there when Jesus was born. And how do you account for that? And I had a doctor of apologetics explain to me in detail how Quirinius was earlier a co-legate of Galatia, and he showed me actual artifacts, and I changed my mind. I don't use that argument anymore.
That's cool. I appreciate your intellectual honesty in giving that up. I would actually, that's actually a fun one, is if we want to talk about arguments that we used to use but don't use anymore. That's right. Actually, I've got plenty. But I'm curious, any other biases that you guys would want to, that you can think of?
For me personally, I would say political bias is probably one thing I have definitely. You know, I go into libertarianism, so I do come at the point where I do recognize my bias on that. And I also know I have a historical bias. Like, when you get into history, that's one of the first things that they teach you is to recognize your bias. And so, you know, there are times when I have to say, like, when I look at the data, I read the books, and I do come to a conclusion. I have to keep in mind that that perhaps, you know, maybe I want this thing, like I'm maybe picking the evidence out where and interpreting things, you know, based on, you know, what I'm reading and what I may be thinking is the most probable conclusion, which is, you know, is a bias. But I think that it's just a good thing to recognize. And I do think I have, of course, I think everyone has a bias to a degree. I just think it's about recognizing the bias that makes you better able to come out of it.
And anybody else before I change the subject? Because it sounds like we might have already exhausted this one.
Yeah, I think, you know, within the Christian circles, I mean, coming from an Anglican background, there's obviously a bias there where I'll tend to lean towards more Anglican scholarship. Within our Christian communities, some issues, I know it may appear that maybe it's beneath us or to look at, but I think understanding the particular worldview that I grew up in, coming out of, you know, the traditional Anglican church, is obviously a number of my biases within the Christian community that obviously stands out for myself.
Thanks for your honesty. So one thing is we talked about, and we got a little bit left. Otherwise, in the meantime, I'm going to say, hey, anybody have questions, please shoot them into the Q&A. And just if it helps me, if you put an @Modern-Day Hysteria, that just lets me know that it's a question for me rather than somebody in the chat. So arguments you don't use anymore. I'm kind of curious what you guys have in mind. I know that for me, one I don't use anymore is I do actually, and I was kind of, I think you could say, I was unsure for a long time. But then I started thinking, yeah, actually, I think that basically evolution, human evolution in particular, can explain moral, you could say, the cause of why we tend to behave morally on average. And so if you want to hear the explanation for that, I know some Christians might disagree with me, but I do think that there are actually like pretty sound explanations that granting long scale evolution of even just human evolution. And I think even on a young Earth perspective, you could adopt this view that people, so, you know, when we do these like models of these computer simulations of what's the most adaptive strategy, cooperate or defect, the evidence suggests that cooperators tend to win so long as they don't let people keep defecting on them. So you initially cooperate, somebody defects on you, you defect back, and you don't do business with them anymore. Long story short, that's the argument that I would say, yeah, I don't think Christians should use this claim that we can't explain why people generally behave morally on atheism. I'm kind of curious what arguments you guys might have that you no longer use or wish your own side would give up.
I think, I'm sorry to jump in, I think certain presuppositional arguments within the Christianity, I think they work well within our Christian communities, but I think here's where Christians maybe should rethink. You know, I believe in it because, you know, my presupposition is I believe the Bible is true, or I believe these documents are correct because I just have faith in them without empirical evidence supporting it. So I think I know very early in my childhood I may have leaned in that direction. I think nowadays I tend more on a historical, evidential position as opposed to presuppositionalism.
Yeah, I have no problem with presuppositionism, just so long as the guy realizes that it's presuppositional. And so you realize that other people can make other presuppositions, and it's arbitrary. You get into that a lot with origins or bust. I'd say that's the one area that I keep on advising both religionists and atheists to kind of be wary about, because you're now moving so far back into the data field of why did life begin, or why did the universe begin, or why did God begin, or how many gods were there, and all that. You're all in speculation land, and it's just it's unresolvable. So, you know, if you so long as you have your hip boots in and realize you're going to get bogged down pretty quick, yeah, just steer clear of it.
Yeah, I'd say the argument that I'm tired of hearing from the atheistic side is that we find ourselves in this universe, and this is the universe we would expect without a God. I don't see how that idea parses out, because you've got, like, for instance, in Islam, you have the concept of Allah's whimsy, which throws a monkey wrench in almost any moral dilemma when it comes to looking through Islamic teachings. Based on that alone, you could say that, at least in Islam, why is the universe the way it is? Why does it seem inefficient in certain ways? Allah's whimsy. That entire thing goes out the window. If you purport it to Yahweh, yeah. Yahweh decided he wanted to do it that way. Well, why did he do that? Well,
because.
Yeah, or just because. The deity does not necessarily have to make things in a way that makes them satisfactory to you when it comes to issues of the universe. So I would really like atheists to not use that argument anymore, because I don't think that argument holds water. There's better ones if you want to use them. Just like I have an entire video actually called Worst Arguments Against God, where I go through a bunch of different arguments against God that I see atheists use, going from like refuting the argument from the first cause, the argument from the stone, and just basically a bunch of arguments that I don't think atheists should use at all in conversation anymore, especially as end-all be-alls, only maybe as thought experiments, and even then I don't like them.
If I had to say one argument that I personally just stopped, I used to think it was such a very convincing argument, but I eventually just, once I read more into the papers, I gave it up. It was the Kalam argument.
Yeah.
Eventually, I was very much sold on it originally.
Well, the Kalam gets you to deism.
Well, yeah, I mean, what got me out of it really is like where I don't consider it as much is because, you know, I read up on the B theory of time, and it's all predicated, the whole argument is predicated on the A theory.
Yes, and with any other theories of time, it falls out.
Yeah, and I just don't.
The issue is that God can't have temporal states, or is it like the? What do you mean by?
I'm just saying that I'm just saying, like, in the context of that argument, I don't.
Oh,
I mean,
okay, I see.
I have seen some people reconcile the Kalam on a B theory. I mean, I haven't gone as much into detail on that, but I mean,
think you can be a Calvinist and still have B theory.
Well, yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I would have to read more into it, but I just stopped doing it. Like, at least the William Lane Craig style, I just stopped doing that because I just did not find it convincing anymore. But I mean,
okay.
Yeah, so that's just me on that one.
I used to think that believers, especially believers in scientific fields, especially life science fields, that could somehow justify their continued belief. I believe that they had a psychological disorder once. I felt superior to them, and I no longer do. I felt that they compartmentalized their belief and all the critical knowledge, thinking skills that they used in every other facet of their life. It was impenetrable in this little lockbox in the back of their brain that they didn't allow to get to their belief. And I felt that somehow made me superior once long ago.
Super interesting.
Yeah, atheism did not give you any more IQ points.
Right. There's very, very smart Christians.
And another thing that I would, this group here reflects, it's atheists and largely Christians with one deist. There's all a broad religious group around there. There's Zoroastrians, there are Shintoists, there are Muslims, and all the rest. And so that the tendency to kind of tunnel vision in on one particular subsect or segment of a particular religious frame makes it kind of a lopsided argument, because there's a broader world out there. And I think it's wise that we never forget that there's an awful lot of different beliefs to go on, and there's a long tradition. Even the term atheist has a pedigree to it. It doesn't always mean the same thing. In the 17th century, an atheist was somebody that didn't believe in the correct God, not that they didn't believe in any gods at all. And only really in the Enlightenment time is the kind of the big atheist, none of the above thing become the standard model for it. But we can get led astray by the groups that we're having the interaction with, when we have to remember, yeah, there's other clubs out there.
I think based on what RJ just said, actually, I think for me, Pascal's wager is, I guess, kind of an argument that I used to use, but I see, where Christians are coming from when they use it, but I think it's not really a good argument, because we wouldn't really, and based on what RJ's saying, there's a broad, spectrum of, obviously, religions out there. So using that argument, we're not going to know which God to believe in. So just saying.
I describe it as Pascal's Las Vegas, that what you actually have is a giant group of competing casinos, each one reflecting various religions. And in the casinos, you have a series of denominational tables, and each one of them is clamoring for you to make your one and only bet. And you're going, which one, which one, which one? It's way more. Pascal, remember, was thinking in terms of Catholicism. He didn't even often offer Protestantism as an option. Forget the Huguenots.
And what's funny is, I've had Muslims, I've had Catholics use that on me, but I wasn't convinced at all. So I'm not really going to use that on an atheist. And I'm not knocking anyone who uses that. But if it wasn't convincing for me to hear that from, say, a Muslim or a Catholic, I don't think it's going to be convincing for an atheist to hear that from me. But, that's just my opinion.
Yeah, it's a slippery slope.
What about the ontological argument? I bring that up, and here's my Anglican bias come out again with Anselm. But even though I get Pascal's wager, but what are some of the atheists' view on the ontological argument?
Oh, why is there something rather than nothing issues?
Well, on that, the highest thought is God. Then
I mean, it would ultimately depend on which version of the ontological argument you're using. Or you would be using Saint Anselm's argument, or would you be using Alvin Plantinga's version, where it's like the modal ontological argument?
No, it'd be Anselm's, and that's my Anglican bias coming out.
Oh, fun fact about Anselm, he was actually inspired by, like he spoke out against child abuse because he was actually abused by his uncle in school. Fun fact.
So if we're doing Anselm's, then we're dealing with a 6 premise, 1 conclusion argument then, or a 5 premise, 1 conclusion argument, correct? That's how his syllogism parses out.
Well, yeah, I often find funny is like a lot of times, because I read up some on it because I was doing a crusades. I mean, I was doing a video on the Middle Ages, and Saint Anselm came up, and I read his argument, and I did actually find it funny because I do often see atheists really confident about saying it's wrong, but actually that's funny because that's something that even I can't remember is, oh yeah, Bertrand Russell. He said it's easier to just say the argument is fallacious than to actually show that it is fallacious.
I'd say that the argument itself isn't necessarily fallacious, because I'm looking at his premises, and the issue that I have, the issue that I have isn't necessarily within the premises, it's with the conclusion, because as an Anglican, obviously his conclusion, he's trying to conclude the Christian God. That's where he's trying to get to. The problem is, though, if somebody is positing in their mind a maximally great being that is not the Christian God, therefore that God exists. If we assume that all 5 of his premises are correct, then whatever God anybody thinks of that they can conceive as maximally greater than the Christian God must therefore exist. That's the issue that I have with that is almost the same issue I have with the Kalam, is that the Kalam can get you to deism fairly quickly with A theory, but it doesn't get you to any particular God, but William Lane Craig wishes that it could. I see the same thing here with the ontological argument, is that all you have to do is posit a being greater than the Christian God in any shape or form, and suddenly you have a God that is not the one the argument was meant to lead you to.
Yeah, there's nothing in principle that rules out tag team gods, or that there are multiple gods that combine together and give up their essence to make universes or alter themselves in various ways, because it's all completely speculative. You can put any assumptions in you like.
Yeah, but and I just want to understand this from the atheist perspective. How do they deal with, I mean, prior to the Enlightenment, all cultures in one way, form, or another had a concept of a god or a great spirit.
Did all cultures, because we actually do have one older culture that we found,
the Paraha.
Yes, who don't have a concept of a god or an afterlife. Like it's not a thing within their history. So we actually do. So what we have instead is not all cultures have a god belief or an idea of God. What we have is most cultures have an idea.
And even the afterlife is an optional one. It only kind of got filtered into the Judeo-Christian context over time because the Greeks and Romans tended to believe that. And of course, in other cultures that have reincarnation, you have a continual cycling of things. It's one of the reasons why one argument that I would tend not to use is the idea that religion stems from a fear of death, because not all religions historically have had an afterlife, and therefore death was just something you accepted, and it was not a reason to maneuver around it. So
what you just said about Christianity is demonstrably false, though, because the book of Job is possibly the oldest book of Scripture, and it speaks of the resurrection in Job. Job describes the resurrection in the afterlife. So in the oldest Christian, in the oldest Judaic text, or certainly one of them, equal in age probably to Genesis, the very resurrection, the doctrine of dying, sleeping in the grave until the day of resurrection, and becoming an eternal spirit living with God, is in fact explained in the book of Job.
Yeah, I mean, it's another one that we'll have to do a separate show on. James, are you finding this whole discussion going in ways you weren't expecting?
It's definitely gone in different directions, but it's good. I think that what we'll do is, because I promised you guys we'd go from 6 or your time, it would be 8:30 to 10:30 Eastern time. Maybe we'll kind of wrap up in the next minute or two. And I want to say thank you guys for being on here. Like if you guys have any last thoughts, you can share them. But otherwise, I actually am very happy. I was at one point I felt a little bit afraid, and I was like, "Oh my gosh, what was I thinking to have so many people?" But you guys
got
are actually,
all these people in the room. It's going to be panic.
you guys have been respectful, and it's been really good to have all you guys, and so I totally appreciate that. And it's also been like I appreciate your guys' intellectual honesty. That's meant a lot to hear your guys' thoughts.
Well, they've been good questions. I think you did a good wrap up for questions that are kind of left on the cutting room floor that deserve to be discussed.
Thanks. I appreciate that. That means a lot. And I enjoyed your guys' thoughts. Like, this is actually one that I'm going to listen to this stream. I'm going to listen to several times probably, because I'm just like, this is actually a lot of different ideas that I learned for the first time, which is exactly what I was hoping for. So, want to remind.
Share one thing?
Yeah.
I just wanted to say I'm going to have a hangout after this one, and anybody wanting to join is welcome. Jackson said he would be interested, and I think someone else has said so. So if you know where my channel is, how to find it, if you'd like to join a discussion about these things afterward, you're free to join.
Jackson can give me a link. I'll be there if you want.
You're more than welcome. I appreciate you coming.
That's awesome. I totally encourage everybody to go on over there. I can't make it, but I am stoked for it. And also, thank you all for tuning in tonight, asking questions, and just kind of listening to the speakers. So if you enjoyed this, we have, in fact, 2 of our people on tonight. RJ Downard and Standing for Truth are going to be debating this coming Wednesday. So if you want a reminder of that, hit that subscribe button, as that will be a debate on creation, evolution, as well as the methods for discovering
the
knowledge.
biblical worldview versus evolution, I think, is the topic. So we want to be precise on that.
That's right. Those are the exact words. So, and as well as the second half will be on the methods of gaining scientific knowledge or knowledge about the world from each camp. So definitely hope you tune into that. I think that'll be a great one with RJ and Standing for Truth. And so I just, again, want to say thanks to the panelists. Their links are in the description. Check them out. Even if you don't agree with them, you can at least understand where they're coming from. So thank you again, panelists, for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you. I really enjoyed it.
Thanks for letting me on.
God bless, brother.
I'm glad that I was able to participate in a headache that didn't involve my hammer today.
Thanks so much. I'm glad. Well, you guys
said a grand total of 4 words, but I appreciate the invite.
Yeah, glad you're here. So I'll see you guys later, and I hope you have a great night. And thank you for watching. Keep sifting out the reasonable from the unreasonable. Have a good night.